A Safari 70 Million Years Ago by Benjamin Michael Tanner. A pack of over 70 compsognathids pecked hungrily at the half-eaten, rotting corpse of the young sauropod, previously killed 2 days prior by a larger predator. Swarms of insects joined in the feast, as they buzzed past the darting, snake-like heads of the little chicken-sized theropods. A sudden zapping sound interrupted the dinosaurs' feast, as all at once the compsognathids turned their heads to a shining blue light appearing out of thin air. The zapping sound increased as the light continued to grow larger, and the more it increased in size, the sharp sound had now transitioned into a high-pitched ringing. The sound hurt the tiny ears of the small dinosaurs as they quickly scurried away from the sauropod carcass into the forest. Susan McGuire stepped through the time portal, suited in her safari armor and oxygen helmet, and armed with her electric rifle. Susan stopped on the other side of the portal, into a world 70,538,475 years before she was assigned to her mission. Today, she was on safari to observe and document a brand new species of dinosaur that had been discovered in 1956 by Soviet paleontologists in the Badlands of Mongolia. But in all that time, over 100 years, from then to the year 2067, all that was found of the animal was a single forelimb, a 10-foot arm with 25-inch talons. Paleontologists from all over the world have scoured the Gobi Desert looking for any more remains that could tell them what this terrible arm belonged to, but no other evidence was ever found. All that scientists could classify was that this animal was a predator, a huge and powerful predator that even rivaled the great tyrant lizard king Tyrannosaurus Rex himself. It was around the year 2037 that time travel had first been orchestrated, now being used by the Paleontological Society as a means of research and documentation, to observe dinosaurs in the flesh and in their natural habitat. Susan was a graduate student of a professor of the University of Alberta in Canada who specialized in the socialization and behavior of predatory dinosaurs. Susan's professor had been on over 20 time safaris throughout his 40-year career in paleontology, and had made many marvelous discoveries and wrote many books and played a huge role in influencing dinosaurs in popular culture in recent years. It was just last year that on one of his last safaris, that Professor Ronan Connors had found coprolites whose DNA had matched that of the forearm of the unknown theropod. 2 more expeditions were launched to capture video evidence of the new animal, but although they captured sound recordings, the animal itself was never captured on film. It was right after getting her degree in paleontology that Susan had jumped at the chance to go on the next safari that was taking place that following September, and to one of his most accomplished students, Professor Connors, granted her request. 4 months later, in September, and 70 million years before, in the Late Cretaceous Period, Susan was surveying the site of the dark and misty prehistoric forest of cycads, conifers, and giant ferns, and hearing the distant calls of the native dinosaurs. She turned to see the time portal closing behind her until it completely disappeared in a zap. She typed at her wrist computer on her left forearm before pointing a scanner at the dead sauropod 20 feet off to her right. Next, She typed into her computer, pulling up her analysis file on the dead specimen. Clade, Titanosaur. Species, Saltosaurus. Diet, herbivore. Maturity, juvenile. Weight, 2 tons. Length, 20 feet. With her analysis finished, Susan deactivated her projected screen and started her way through the jungle. The forest was alive with every variety of strange and exotic sounds. The screeching of pterosaurs, croaking of prehistoric frogs, the buzzing of giant dragonflies. Up in the trees, Susan could see beautifully colored dino birds soaring through the canopy. These beautiful, feathered, flying dinosaurs had violet pigments on their upper body, while the underbelly was bone white, and the feathers were yellow and orange, with patterns of black spots in the middle of each feather. Susan tried to get a scan on one of them, but they were moving too fast through the air, and they disappeared into the canopy. Well, she missed that chance, but Susan didn't worry too much about it. The forest of the Cretaceous was teeming with strange and wonderful creatures, many of them completely new species. She had been hiking through the forest for over 2 hours, and within that time, Susan scanned and cataloged a few new plant species, a new species of salamander, and a new species of rhamphorhynchid she found lying dead in her path. Susan was just passing by a tree fern when a sudden rustling off to her left startled her. She readied her stun gun to defend herself as she waited for whatever creature to show itself. Out of the ferns, sprawling on 4 muscular legs, was a giant iguana, like the ones that Susan had seen in Central America that one summer she took a holiday there. The iguana was massive. It was bigger than a saltwater crocodile. It moved slowly as it crossed the dirt trail in front of Susan. Susan just stood there and watched as the giant reptile sank into the undergrowth. She didn't think to pull up her scanner until the last minute. By that time, the iguana was already gone. The image of the fantastic creature was already embedded in Susan's mind. It had a midnight blue head, and the rest of its body was a dark teal, with orange and brown stripes decorating its body, with a row of spines running down its back and tail. With her chance to classify a new species all but spent, Susan continued on her way down the path, pushing deeper into the forest. It was close to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the Cretaceous heat was at 40 degrees. Susan could feel the cold sweat running down her back as her body temperature was rising as she continued on her way. She had covered a distance of almost 60 miles, and now she needed to stop. Susan found a patch of shade under a grove of ferns and sat down. She removed her helmet and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her left hand, and laid back on the cold, shaded earth. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the forest fill her ears. The sounds of birds calling, the distant cries of dinosaurs, the croaking of frogs, and the chirping of crickets. The forest ambiance made Susan feel relaxed, like she was at home in her own bed, listening to rain sounds on her TV at 2 in the morning, with her glow-in-the-dark star stickers lighting up her walls, making the nights seem less dark and gloomy. Susan could feel herself drifting off, and before she could realize that her body was shutting off, she had already drifted off to sleep. By the time Susan woke up, it was already dark. She awoke, startled, at the sound of crunching vegetation right next to her. She ducked her head and rolled over to her left, onto her belly, and peered out through the gap in the fern leaves. There, in a huge clearing in the forest, was this group of large duck-billed dinosaurs browsing on the low-hanging cycads. Susan recognized these dinosaurs off by heart. These were hypacrosaurs. She read about them in her paleontology class. However, there was something very peculiar about these animals. They seemed to be glowing in the dark. Susan couldn't believe what she was seeing. These hypacrosaurs were bioluminescent. They had the ability to emit their own light in the dark. Susan had never imagined that dinosaurs could do that. It was like something out of a fairy tale or science fiction world she read about in her youth. She continued to watch the herd from her refuge in the undergrowth. There were at least 24 females, half of them with offspring, 3 younger males, and the biggest, the elder male, whom Susan instantly concluded was the leader. The large male approached this young female, and the alpha showed off his mating display. He flashed his head crest and inflated his nasals. At first, the female didn't seem interested, but the alpha regained her attention by flaring out a flap of skin on his throat, the same way a male iguana would do to entice a female. The alpha's throat flap glowed a bright pink with reddish-purple leopard spots. This dazzling display won the heart of the younger female, and she embraced her new mate. The 2 dinosaurs cuddled their heads together as the female ran the side of her body against the older male. His eyes followed her as she walked past him, and she stopped. The female looked back at her mate, exposing the underside of her huge tail to prompt him. Susan watched from her hiding spot as the alpha male mounted his upper torso on the female's back and began the mating process as he thrust into her. The sound of the female dinosaur moaning gave Susan a flashback of the first time she had sex with someone she had a major crush on back in her senior year in high school. It was an amazing experience for her and one of the happiest times of her life. That is, until her parents found out. Susan never forgot the amount of trouble she got into after that, but it still made for a funny story as she got older. The calm and peaceful atmosphere of the night, orchestrated by the glowing dinosaurs, was suddenly interrupted by the loud honking of a nearby sentry. The herd was still, and the alpha sniffed the air and bellowed out an order. Immediately afterwards, the herd was on the move, moving out of the clearing and back into the depths of the forest. Susan came out from under the ferns and into the clearing where the hypacrosaurs had just stood, and watched as their bioluminescent glow faded away into the darkness. Susan was alone now. The forest was still and silent. There wasn't even the sound of crickets chirping in the night. Susan began to feel her anxiety wash over her. With her helmet back on her head, she switched on her flashlight attached next to her visor. She looked around for any signs of movement, but there was nothing in sight. Susan then typed up her motion detector on her computer, but still there was nothing. With no other choice, Susan made her way into the forest, with her flashlight guiding her way. She had her shock rifle on full charge, and always kept her eye on her motion detector. The further she walked through the dark forest, the more unnerved she became. She could feel her heart thumping in her chest with every step she took. She never liked the dark, and even now she regretted ever dozing off in that patch of ferns. Susan took another look at her tracker when her light caught something embedded in the forest floor. A huge three-toed footprint. Susan's blood ran cold as she instantly recognized this print to have been made by a large predator. She followed the direction the track was heading, and heading off into the forest was an enormous stride of dinosaur footprints. Despite her better judgment, Susan forced herself to follow. This was all in the name of research, and if this was the animal she came looking for in the first place, she had to find it. Susan tread her feet slowly into the soil, always watching where she put her feet, careful not to step on a twig, and always watching for any movement on her detector. She lifted her gaze up for a moment to see where she was actually going, and stopped. Right in front of her was the trunk of a large conifer, with 3 huge talon marks scarred across its bark. This was not the work of any late Cretaceous carnivore that Susan knew of, a raptor or a tyrannosaur. This was something bigger and more powerful. Susan knew right away. This was it. This was the animal she was looking for. But now that she knew it's been there, she needed to tread with caution. Deeper and deeper into the forest she went, walking ever so steadily, not making a sound. As she passed by a cycad, she heard the faint buzzing sound of insects swarming. Susan followed the buzzing a few yards further into the black woods, and right after she passed by some tree ferns, she saw something that almost made her gag. There, in the middle of a small clear patch of earth, was the body of a dead dinosaur, torn, half-eaten, and swarming with flies. But this wasn't just any dinosaur, let alone one that Susan was expecting, like a hadrosaur or a ceratopsid. No, this was a theropod, a tyrannosaur, the apex predator of the Cretaceous. Or so that's what Susan originally thought. Susan inspected the body more closely and saw that the disembowelment and the slicing in the throat were similar to the claw marks seen back on the conifer. For the sake of knowledge, Susan examined the dead animal, and its fact file immediately popped up, and Susan instantly recognized it off the bat. This was a Daspletosaurus, fully grown male, but this knowledge left Susan at a loss. Daspletosaurus was one of the largest, most powerful carnivores of the Cretaceous, millions of years before its descendant, the great Tyrannosaurus rex, and it had a bite force to literally bite the head clean off of a fully grown ceratopsid. So what kind of predatory creature could take down an equally powerful carnivore such as this? What in the world was this creature? Susan was so preoccupied with her own thoughts that she wasn't even aware of her surroundings anymore. She was caught completely by surprise as a large 3-digit hand, armed with massive claws, grabbed Susan from behind. She lost her grip on her stun gun as it slipped out of her hands and onto the ground. Susan squirmed madly to reach it, but it was no use. She was dragged helplessly into the dark as her flashlight suddenly went dead. The silence of the dark jungle was broken by the sound of blood-curdling shrieks, followed by the sharp sound of crunching bones. Everything was silent again. No birds, No frogs, no crickets, nothing. Just the cold, eerie, dead silence as the predator prowled in the darkness, watching and waiting for more unsuspecting prey unfortunate enough to stray into its den.